Crichlow. I'm from York University. Our first speaker will be Michèle Newton. Michèle Newton is an amateur photographer, a pianist, a poet, an influencer, and a freelance writer living in Barrie, Ontario. She is the creator of Our Mosaic Lives, a blog celebrating Black Canadian women. She, on her blog, shares better together outlook on life through articles and reflections, focusing on community events, experiences, and projects. A budding social entrepreneur, Michèle is community-minded in her approach, and she brings together for-profit and nonprofits to impact change through public relations, and she has a firm called PMJ Inc. Michèle holds a Master's of Business Administration and Project Management from Alabaster University, a bachelor's degree in science from Carleton University, and public relations certificate from Ryerson University, and an honors marketing certificate from Algonquin College. Michèle's paper is entitled Better Together Journey. Michèle.
Hello? Good. Okay. So I would loosely call this a paper. It's really a little slideshow that I put together to talk to you about my background and my Better Together journey. I was going to tell you all the things that were just said about who I am, so I won't. I'll skip that. I am many things, but hopefully you'll see that I have often been the only, a token. So whether I was at school, I was the only person who was brown, and I consider myself Black because I was the blackest person in the room. Everywhere that I've worked, I've been the only Black person in a room, in a big organization. At university, I was fitting out and being different because I wasn't Black enough. Someone made reference to that earlier. So again, I found myself to be one of the onlys, and I had first heard the word mulatto, which I believe is actually a mixture of Mexican heritage and white, and I'm like, well, I'm not a mulatto. I'm not a mulatto, and they're like, well, you must be, because that's the only word we can identify you as. So I always felt like I was fitting out, and I'm working on, I guess, finding where I'm from and how that all works. I didn't always know that I was different, though. When I was 5, my family moved to England, and up until that time, I hadn't really noticed that I didn't look like the rest of my family. They're all white, and I'm brown. And this was pointed out to me really rudely by a lot of the school children that I went to school with. They called me a Paki. They didn't seem to, I guess, have another word to describe me, but I was that person. And it made it very difficult for me that year. Now, I was only 5, so I think it's good that I was already somewhat formed as a person, somewhat already had that independent mindedness and confidence. But my mom tells me stories of that year where I could do whatever I wanted because I was Black. Obviously, they clarified at home that I wasn't a Paki, but that I had this difference. So everything at home became a bit of a struggle and a battle. And I think for my family, they were, I guess always prepared for that, but not prepared for that in their 5-year-old. My sister, who was just about half a year old at that time, was also white. So it was a bit of a new time for me. Going forward from that, I guess I would just say that I consider myself a bit of a mosaic. So I'll tell you a bit about my past and how that brings me to be here in terms of being a Black German. My mom is of a Russian-German background. Her family is Mennonites that were in Germany originally, but they were persecuted because they were pacifists, so they had to flee. They fled to Russia. So actually, my mom's dad was born in Russia, but they never identified as Russian. They always identified as German, and then they fled to Poland, and then they came to Canada. And they came in through Pier 21 in Halifax. My mom has been back there. She's retracing her roots and seen the log and the ledger, and they were given or had access to a farm in Landmark, Manitoba. So my mom was born of this couple, white German couple with this history, and born in Canada on a farm in Manitoba. She was a Mennonite and went to practice, preaching that word or being involved in the community in Oklahoma. And there she met my dad, a Black American. We're not in connection with this person, so I don't know what the African American roots are, but I do know that my dad was a Black American. So I put this on as somewhere in Africa and some American. So talking about being transnational, because my Black American father isn't part of my life, my mom met and married a British guy, also white. So as you can see from this photo, I had a little sister who's white, my dad's white, my mom's white, and I'm brown, which is known as Black to me. And my dad raised me as his own. That's the only dad I know. But hey, I had an all-white upbringing. So when I was thinking about this from a German perspective, there's a lot of German traditions, because I would have to say that until recently, I wouldn't have called myself a Black German. But hey, I eat Raukuchen with watermelon. We make German pancakes. We have a whole bunch of German traditions, and Pascha, the never-ending Easter bread. Some of them might even have Russian influences, but I feel like I've passed on these German things. My mom spoke German. I didn't learn German, but we do have some words that I understand. On the British side, well, I do bird watching, train spotting, and I drink tea, and I did a biology degree because I love bird watching. So it was very influential. But again, in this environment that I was blending different cultures and different nationalities, I was the only. I had the fortune of meeting somebody in my world, and it's funny because he came from this sort of same community that I grew up in Newfoundland. We moved to Newfoundland when I was in grade 6. I had a very interesting experience there, being an only. One day, for some reason on the bus, a bunch of students decided they had an issue with me, and I was spit on. So I just hunched down in my seat, and I think I remember it more talking about it than I remember the action. And I ended up staying on the bus till it got to the end, and then I guess my mom was like, "Where is my kid? What's going on?" So anyways, they found out that I had been on the bus and I had been mistreated, and the only thing they could say was it because I was Black. So the principal, and again, I think, ignorance, well-meaning but very damaging, I think, had the whole school had it. He went class to class. What would it be like if you were the only white person in a whole school of Black people? It didn't help the situation, but I think that he was doing something to try to recognize that you could feel different and you could be treated differently, and he felt everyone should be treated the same. So yeah, all white upbringing, very interesting times. So somewhere in Newfoundland, not far from me, was a man who was also a transnational. He was being raised by a French father from St. Pierre-et-Miquelon, and a mother who was Canadian in Newfoundland, which was its own country for some time up until 49. And his name is Pierre. Guess what he had? An all-white upbringing. And I put the French baguette because his father is very French, so he had this sort of French. He learned French. They went to France for a couple of years to live, where he struggled a lot being Black, so he's adopted into a white-only family. His brother is also of mixed race, not brothers genetically, adopted. Anyway, so I wanted to bring that in because I feel like we found each other. Is it meant to be? Do we have a shared heritage and an understanding of being of different races in one and being considered Black as a mixed person? Yes, we do. So I think for me, that's the first time that I felt that I lived an identity that had Blackness. Now, he also didn't listen to jazz music growing up. He didn't do things that, funnily enough, we resonate with. It wasn't like we're like, hey, we're both Black, let's get jazz albums, let's start listening to them. But it just came, like I heard the music, and it moved me. I play instruments, I learned classical music. What would you learn on CBC Classical Radio? Classical music. Now I play jazz piano. It's just in there, and we were able to have that experience. So when we had our child together, it makes you think. And I know she looks very fair there, but hey, she is a brown baby. She's a product of these brown people. In this picture I wanted to just share, there's, my German heritage mom with me and the baby, and, we're still sharing this life. Don't know if I had showed that. So that's our little family photo that we took. So, it's sort of here's a family of like people. For my husband, it was the first time that he had met a blood relative, was when our baby was born. He doesn't know his family. My mom is my mom, my birth mom. I don't know my birth father, but at least I felt like I have a connection to my roots. So I'm on some type of a journey now, trying to understand. I know a bit about this German side. I know a little bit about our history and coming over at Pier 21 and how hard that was for my mom in the 60s to be pregnant with a black child. Her German parents wanted nothing to do with her. She ended up going to an aunt and uncle in Hamilton to have that baby, which was me, and to be part of that. So it's just trying to understand, that side I have a perspective. The other side, not so much. So if you want to talk about transnational, here's a kid that I think there's an opportunity for us to explore our own roots through her, because on the one side, she's got this African-American, Canadian firstborn with a German-Russian background. That's all coming through me as a Canadian of second generation. And on the other side, you've got her dad, who has got Barbadian and Canadian from a French-Canadian mom who he doesn't know, but also some French influences from his immediate family. So I feel like I've just come to a point with my daughter and just growing older where I call it going back to black. I don't know. I like Amy Winehouse, I guess. But it's become a place for me to realize that I need to explore some other parts of me, and it's not just playing jazz music. It started when I was looking around here in Canada at Black History Month. I live in Barrie. It's about 40 minutes north of Toronto. So if you've walked around Toronto, you say, hey, it's very multicultural. There's a lot of races and ethnicities here. Go to Barrie. Nothing. It's pretty plain. So come February in Black History Month, each year I kind of, since I've had my daughter, because it's only been recognized in Canada for 10 years officially, Black History Month. I'm like, where is anything going on for Black History Month? Nothing's happening. And it really, I couldn't tell if I was annoyed about it or okay about it, because the white side of me is like, whatever. The black side of me is like, what? So I really felt like I wanted to celebrate and talk to other black women and find out, am I alone in this feeling? What are you experiencing? So it was mentioned earlier, I launched a blog called Our Mosaic Lives, and really a personal project for me, but it is turning into something more. I interviewed 7 women. I hadn't met them before. They were referred to me, and talked to them, like, what do you think? Should there be Black History Month? Does it matter to you? And then I was like, while you're here, who were your role models? Because I grew up with no role models of color. None, and we weren't media people, so we didn't have TV on. I had nothing. And I found some interesting conversations there. And who are your mentors and role models today? And what are you trying to help your children look to the future with? So I was able to ask these women these questions, and it helps me understand me. And it helped them understand themselves as well. So I feel like it's a journey of seeking to be understood, but also seeking to understand and really wanting to have that feeling with others. So in kind of my conclusions of what I've done in this work so far, and I'm doing a next series called Our Views on Success, because I want to know why sometimes I don't feel successful. And people are like, oh, you got an MBA and a BSc and a thing, and you got a great daughter. Why am I questioning this? So by exploring that with other people who are similar to me in some ways, maybe I can uncover some of that. And I can also help my daughter, who's 12, go forward in her life feeling like, oh, I am achieving success, and it can be this, and it can mean different things. But my main point of this globe slide is just that I felt that together we are better, and it's really just this one world, and we're all trying to figure out how to navigate it and how to live together in it. I put this up because this is my friend's daughter in Barrie, like I mentioned. Actually, she's in Innisfil. Sorry, she's in Innisfil. Innisfil's more diverse, yes. And again, so she is somebody that I talk to try to connect to on my Better Together journey, so that maybe her daughter can look to the future as well, kind of going, yeah, I might be the only, but understanding where we fit in this. This is just kind of the last quote that I wanted to put out there, is that I feel like our strength lies in our differences rather than trying to, whitewash ourselves and straighten our hair. And, I'm really even examining, I worked in corporate world for a long time, wearing suits and things like that I don't think that's me. So coming here today, I had a dress on earlier with heels, and I thought, you know what? That's a different person than I have become over the last little while of turning 50 years old and exploring some of these things with other women. And I want to be able to be me. And I don't care if you don't like these shoes. it's me. I'm okay with it. So just the idea of, you know, being together and celebrating those differences as a strength as a community. So that's just a little bit about me. I have this little hashtag. I've had it on my license plate for a long time, and originally it started because of having my daughter and realizing that the three of us were the same and we're better together. But I think it has broader implications. And there's my timer. Okay, I'm done. So thank you for your time.
Thank you, Michèle. That was an intriguing presentation, and I see that you and your daughter share a significant interest in that leopard skin design there, and your blouse choice, and so on. Okay, our next speaker is Mark Morrison Reed, the Reverend Dr. Mark Morrison Reed, I should say. He earned his master's degree at the University of Chicago in 1977 and his Doctor of Ministry at Medville Lombard Theological School in 1979. He served as minister to congregations in Rochester, New York, and Toronto, Canada, before becoming an allied affiliated faculty at Medville Lombard Theological School and coordinator of its Sankofa collection, the focus of which is people of the global majority who were Unitarian Universalists. He has also served as president of the Canadian Unitarian Council and president of Family Services Association of Metropolitan Toronto. Dr. Morrison Reed is primarily recognized as a historian of the African American experience within Unitarian Universalism. He has published widely, including his 2008 memoir, In Between, a memoir of an integration baby, which I think is available outside. He will soon publish a new book revisiting the empowerment controversy, Black Power and Unitarian Universalism, which should be out this month or next month at least. Speaking of transnational perspectives, Dr. Morrison Reed embodies an international experience or international experiences. He moved to Switzerland with his family in 1962 when his father spent a sabbatical year at the University of Bern. His family returned to Chicago a year later, but he remained until 1965. Revisiting Switzerland in 1971, he stayed and later moved to Austria before returning to Chicago in 1974. In 1987, he spent a sabbatical year in Switzerland, and in 1988, he moved with his wife and co-minister and their two children to Toronto. So since 1993, at least, he's held dual citizenship in the US and Canada. Dr. Morrison Reed.
There we go. Thank you. I'm glad to be here. I'm glad to. So most of the story is going to be the preliminary to arriving here in 1998. So that's kind of how I ended up here. Though I won't talk much about him being in Canada. And I don't get to talk about this much. I do lots of other stuff. I talk about other people's history, but this piece of my life that I'm going to unpack is one I don't get to unpack that often. So James Baldwin is mostly exclusively, but not exclusively, associated with Harlem and Paris and France. However, in 1951 and 52 and 53, he made three visits, we might say retreat, to Leukerbad. It's located in the Upper Valais in southwest Switzerland. There he wrote an essay. It was entitled Stranger in the Village. It appeared in Harper's Magazine, October 1953, and later in the collection, Notes of a Native Son. You may have seen it there. He wrote this: "From all available evidence, no black man had ever set foot in this tiny switch village. I remained as much a stranger today as I was the first day I arrived, and the children shouted, 'Nega, nega,' as I walked along the street. Some thought my hair was the color of tar, that it was the texture of wire or a texture of cotton. It was jocularly suggested that I might let it grow long and make myself a winter coat. If I sat in the sun more than 5 minutes, some daring creature would come along and gingerly put his finger on my hair as though he was afraid of an electric shock, or put his hand on my hand, astonished that the color did not rub off. In all this, in which I must concede there was a charm of genuine wonder, there was no suggestion that I was human. I was simply a living wonder." Around the time that The Stranger in the Village was published, Vincent O. Carter arrived in Bern. Born and raised in Kansas City, Carter enlisted, having lied about his age, and fought in France. Set on becoming a writer, he did what writers were supposed to do, and he returned to Europe in 1953, actually the same year that Chester Himes did, on the same boat on a different voyage, as far as I can tell. His experience in Switzerland paralleled Baldwin's. In his first book, it was entitled The Bern. Where we go? Oh, come on. I'm going the wrong way. That's the problem. There he is. Sorry. Was I talking about him and not showing you? Should have stopped me. There we go. The Bern book, a record of the voyage of the mind. It's an odd book. It's not a protest book at all. It's his musings. He claimed he was the only black man in Bern, capital of Switzerland, which might have been true between 1954 and 57 when he was writing the book. That is, if one doesn't include the people in the Liberian embassy. One chapter bears this title: "Everybody, man, woman, everybody, men, women, children, dogs, cats, and other animals, wild and domestic, looked at me all the time." In July 1962, when I was 13, my family moved to Bern. Our experience mirrored Baldwin's and Carter's. Soon after our arrival, my mother, brother, and I were walking toward the Bahnhof. It's the old Bahnhof, when a man on the other side of Langasse Strasse grabbed his companion's arm, pointed at us, and yelled, "Nigger, nigger!" I froze. My brother clenched his fist, moved to the curb, and said, "Mother, they're calling us niggers." Before he could utter another word or make another move, she grabbed our wrist, dragged us down the block, down Bubenbergplatz. "Stop it," she snapped. "They're saying nigger. That's how you say Negro in German. There's no reason to get angry. Control yourselves." "But Mama," I said. I protested. "Hush," she hissed, obeying her protective instinct, a hair-trigger reaction that squashed any move to confront a white man. People are simply surprised to see Negroes. We're exotic, she said. They've never seen people like us before, so get used to it. Getting used to it was hard. It happened constantly on the street, in the trams, in the store, and it made us mad. Children in particular whispered loudly, "Lorganegally." We stared them down. We crossed our eyes. We stuck out our tongues. Adults were nearly as outrageous as the children. They stopped whatever they were doing and stared, mouths open. A few even asked to touch my 3-year-old sister's braided hair, and some simply just reached in to grab her little pigtails without asking. That's the way it was. My brother and I staring at them, staring at us. And I had no idea what they saw, but I saw a stiff, somber people whose formality didn't hide their rudeness. So, how did an African American family of 6 come to be there in 1962? Well, it was unusual, but not unheard of. In 1892, W. Du Bois, we've already talked about. W. Du Bois, the primary, actually foremost black intellectual and co-founder of the NAACP, 1909, attended the University of Berlin. 1910, Alan Locke, another premier black intellectual of that era, was awarded a fellowship at the Humboldt University of Berlin. I'm not sure when Carter Woodson must have been around that same era. I know that the zoologist, Ernest Everett Just, was invited to do research at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Berlin in 1929 and made several trips there until 1933 when the National Socialist Party took control. 1929 was the same year that the chemist Percy Julian began work toward a PhD at the University of Vienna. So over the years, my understanding of how my dad came to be awarded the National Science Foundation Fellowship has changed and deepened. Once I would have said if it was just because his colleague in 1961, Fritz Hautermans, director of the Physics Institute at the University of Bern, invited him. Later, I would point back to how it was my father fell in love with chemistry. It was in high school, 1936. Realizing to study chemistry required German, Dad had to find a teacher and recruit the other students because during World War I and the anti-German sentiment, it had been dropped from the curriculum. He went to Dunbar. A more recent revelation of the sorts, and then the research is that Dad's parents, they were both clerks with the federal government, but he grew up hanging around the Howard University campus, where his uncle, a contemporary of Alan Locke's, a contemporary of Georgia Simpson, who Dad may have taken German from, but I asked his brother and he couldn't remember, hung around with, was running buddies with Mordecai Johnson Jr., the son of the first African-American president of Howard University. What that meant was they had the run of the campus. They could do what they want. They had programs for them. But in that context, my dad had role models that left him to believe it was possible to become a scientist, something that was otherwise unimaginable in 1930s Jim Crow America. During the 1950s, Dad, a nuclear chemist who'd worked on the atomic bomb on the Manhattan Project, began traveling to conferences around America and in Europe. One hot summer, on their way home from a conference, a Thing with Gordon conference in New Hampshire, a colleague asked my dad why he was wearing a suit and tie, sport coat and tie, and Dad replied, "I have to." Dad said, "I was an ink spot," was the way Dad described himself. So via osmosis, I took all of this in. Fall 1971, age 22, I flew to Ireland to work on a project with a dozen Euro-American buddies from my college, Beloit College. I wore a sport coat, turtleneck. They wore sweatshirts. Approaching the passport control, I actually rushed ahead to separate myself from them, that rabble. I sailed right through. They all were stopped and questioned. I knew better. Months later, I returned to Switzerland and stayed until 1973. Arriving in Switzerland, I felt this kind of there's a wariness, there's a tension I always feel, but there it melted away. You know, I'd always taken it in from my father and his brothers and others that Europe was simply a safer place if you were black. Yes, of course, there were awkward situations, but there were never life-threatening ones. Yet I quickly learned of the anti-immigration party, Vigilance in Geneva, and James Schwarzenbach, and his xenophobic rantings in German-speaking Switzerland, part of Switzerland. A referendum on Überfremdung lost. That's kind of the foreign invasion. Überfremdung lost while it was aimed largely back then at Italians and Yugoslavs. I could sense Switzerland was becoming less hospitable place for people like me. There we go. Carter was still living in Bern when I was back that time. The Bern book had come out a year earlier, although I did not discover it until years later. In hindsight, I'm sorry I never met him. His partner, who Warren's met as well, Lisa Lott, told me I would have liked him, and I have many questions I would have liked to have asked Carter. The Barron book opens with Carter sitting in the Café du Commerce and when someone asks a question he most dreads, this is the question: how did you come to live in Bern? It's a loaded question. He usually tried to absent himself when it was asked. The question, it really doesn't interest me. What I wanted to know is what he was looking for that led him to remain all those years. See, I faced that question myself in '73. My Swiss friends peppered me with questions when I talked about going back to the U.S. They said, well, what about Vietnam? What about Watergate? Isn't Nixon a crook? Why would you go back? And I wrestled with that, and I wrestled with it, and not to remain or not, sensing I would never be more than an oddity. At least that's what it felt to me there in Switzerland, and that I had responsibilities best met in the U.S., I returned in 1974. Carter spent the rest of his life in Bern. He died in 1984. In March 1987, I returned with my own family to spend 6 months in Switzerland. Weeks later, on May, I guess it was the Monday, April 6th headlines in the International Tribune were this: Swiss vote to tighten refugee law. The vote approved a federal referendum that enables the Swiss Bundesrat to tighten restrictions on refugees and to make political asylum more difficult to obtain. Although both the Catholic Church and the Protestant churches opposed it, it passed by a margin of 2-1. 17 years earlier, with Schwarzenbach's Überfremdung referendum, had garnered support from 45% of the electorate. Was asylum being abused as the government claimed? Or, as its opponents argued, was the issue skin color and race, since most of the recent refugees were from the Middle East, Asia, and Africa, were not white? I wondered if the vote reflected the natural mindset of a people used to being hemmed in by mountain peaks and remote valleys, terrain that long protected them from the world beyond. Was this the Swiss reaction to a world that could no longer be kept out? Or was something different emerging, something new, provincialism evolving into racism? As I returned to Switzerland and Germany in 1998 and 2003, I saw more and more people of color take up residence. In 2004, I spent time in this tiny village, Bargang. It's north of Bordeaux. During that 2 weeks, I saw one other black person. That was unusual. So it was being stopped by the gendarmerie twice. But it was the week following the Madrid bombing, in which 191 people died. as I have gone almost annually to Germany since 2008, where my son, an engineer with Bosch, and my German-born grandson have lived until literally 3 weeks ago, I came to the realization that I was no longer a curiosity, no longer simply a living wonder, no longer something exotic. I was rather seen by some or many as a threat and an invader. Last year, a Swiss survey seems to bear some of this out. 1,700 people were asked, with whom would you not like to work? 70% identified Albanians, 66% Middle Easterners, and over half Africans and Turks. When asked if race played a role, only 14% said made a difference. The author, who's white, I assume, surmised that nationality and religion was more a determinant than race. I'm not sure. Since Jane Baldwin arrived in Leukerbad 67 years ago, much has changed. But whether a living wonder or a threat, what has not changed is the reality of objectification, of not being seen for who one is, nor one's basic humanity affirmed. This is going on the same time that people of color are becoming more deeply integrated into Swiss and German society. I know a group of mixed race, they're all in their 30s now. I've known them since they were infants. First cousins, and that includes among them a web designer, a nurse, an architect, an actress, and an electrical engineer. I was there when he came home from having served for his first leave from the Swiss Army. But he is Swiss, and I was so proud to be there with him. You know, the one Swiss player in the NBA is mixed race, Thambo Cephaloggia, or whether it's FC Basel or FC Bern or München Bayern or the VfB Stuttgart, every Fußballmannschaft has players of color. You can't find them without players of color, and you can't also find football hooligans who scream AFA. AFA, you know what AFA is? And throw bananas. In Germany, the male vocalist for Ich und Ich, Adel Twal, he was born in Germany. Interesting, in neither of those albums, Ich und Ich or Von selben Stern, is race mentioned. I was surprised when I went to check. But perhaps rather than be surprised, we should accept this whole reality. That is the discord and the ordinary and mundane, the triumph and the tragic, and that they are normative and they are necessary. Thank you.
Also wonderful content stories. So I'll just open it up to the audience to respond to our speakers. Well, I will ask her. I've been dying to ask Morrison Reed this question. It's true that we have this kind of connection with Vincent Carter. I too have been going to Bern for a number of years. But I've also been teaching Mark Morrison Reed, and there's this wonderful story in a book called Ticking Along with the Swiss. And in this, one of the interesting encounters that he describes in this book is when he was young, 13-year-old or 14-year-old, it was summer, he was taking a sled back to a friend who loaned it to him. It was in the middle of the summer. Here he is with his shorts and looking very Swiss, carrying a sled. And the Swiss were saying, "Oh, well, look at this guy. He's come from Africa. He's looking for snow." So, he doesn't know any better. So Mark tells his story in a very interesting way. And so I wonder if you want to say a bit more about that in relationship to.
But by then, my Swiss German was good enough to at least understood what he was saying, and so so I heard this, and I didn't. I said, "Grüße miteinander." I gave him the traditional Swiss greeting and kept going. By then, I was laughing all the way across to my friend's house with this, those wood sleds, and then returning it to Ralph. It was but that kind of thing happened. You just got used to it, it happened all the time, as Carter said. I have a question for you, Michèle. Do you have a Newfie identity?
So I have been asked this before, why I don't have a Newfoundland accent, because my dad's British. So speaking with a British accent, which he's never lost, and my mom didn't seem to pick up a Newfoundland accent. I can get it when I'm there for like 2 weeks, but it falls away when I come back. Yeah, so in terms of Newfoundland culture, because my family didn't have that in its roots, I didn't inherit any of that. My husband, though, because his mother is from Newfoundland, and he has that, eating the meals that are more traditionally Newfoundland that she made and different things along those lines. But yeah, I guess we're just imports. We're actually called CFAs, which another way, come from away. You can never outlive it. No, you have to be born in Newfoundland, and then I'm not sure if you were brown and born in Newfoundland if you can outlive it. But
my girlfriend, my daughter has one of her girlfriends is from a Chinese family, a Chinese restaurant in Newfoundland, but prior to Confederation, 1949. Because it's another culture. It's one other of that part. It's a part of that mosaic. I guess I was gonna.
I think it is in there. I certainly have a love of nature. Living in Newfoundland and growing up, doing all of the outdoor activities there really nurtured the bird watching. That's really big there. So, I guess from that perspective, but also just an appreciation for, living on the oceans and taking care of the environment that you're in. That's certainly more prevalent in terms of top of mind.
I want to ask Michèle this. To what degree, where you live now, has that your background been a choice as to where you live now, since you have, as an adult, have some choices?
So I always wanted to live somewhere more diverse, and just the way that it worked out, my husband's a military person, and he got moved around against his choice. He didn't have choice in his placement, so he was originally posted in Valcartier, and we didn't move there because I didn't speak French, but he was moved there because he's fluently French. Then he got posted to Barrie. So in essence, the roots of staying in Barrie started with the military experience, and because he's a physician, he's now established a practice and those things. So what we do in terms of conscious choices around living in an environment that doesn't have a large diversity number, so just numerically, Canada is at 2.9% of the population identifies as Black. That number is lower than the Ontario average and the Canadian average in Barrie. So it's very, very small percentage. We send our daughter to a school where there are more visible minorities. It may have its other complications because the people who can afford to send their kids to those schools might also be coming from a white background, or it has a socioeconomic difference. But at least in her world, when I asked her about some of my work, she said, "But Mom, I'm me. And in a way, I felt that that was good, because in her school, she doesn't feel like anyone is different. I don't know if it's an illusion, but I'm comfortably happy that she's in that environment. But if she was in the public school system, she would be in a school where she'd be the only one. Because there's enough schools where you can spread out the black families, and there's one here, one here. So I go to your point, I would have liked to live somewhere else, and maybe I will in the future, but that's where we are for now.
Thank you both for these just amazing stories, life stories. They're so rich, and I just really enjoyed both of them. I guess I have a question for each of you, but I just wanted to say, Michèle, I loved your point. I think I heard you right in saying that you didn't feel quite like fully a black person until you met your life partner. Did I get that right?
I
Did
think
hear that right?
that I felt like I had been labeled a black person, but I feel like I'm the whitest black person you'll ever meet. So meeting another person who has similarities to me, who would probably himself also say that he's raised in a very white household and feels not connected at all with his black culture, we have an opportunity now to change that course. And I'm actually on part of my journey investigating a little bit more about my birth father, because I feel like that's a piece that is of me, and I know his name, but I've never met him, and I'm 50. So is it a chance to start to bring that into that? And I feel encouraged by my husband to be able to do that, whereas I don't think my family was discouraging me, but I think it was just, if she doesn't mention it, then she's good. And so I don't know what that conversation is going to look like. I have to have that with them now that I'm ready to go down that journey in my black family to meet my father and him to meet his granddaughter. And maybe there are other people that are like me that I would meet. Sorry, that got long. But.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thanks. Mark, I was just wondering about your point that you brought up when you said you felt that it was never, I believe I heard you correctly, that it was never life-threatening being black in Switzerland. And I'm not challenging that, but I was wondering if you could talk more about what that was like to be there as a black person, but not the target of the anti-immigrant party in Switzerland. I know many of us have lived in, outside of our countries where we grew up, and it can be was it a dislocating experience? Was it alienating? Was it strange to be a person of color, African American, in this place where they might have been talking about other people of color? Or just, if you could just talk about what that felt like, or what that was like.
Yeah, so the problem when I first got was Italian. I mean, that's from the Swiss vantage point. It was Italians, and then the Yugoslavs, and later the Turks. But it was not aimed at not aimed at black folks, because there just weren't that many. And so I had a little breathing, and it was others. Discomfort, and yet I know it wasn't going to get aimed at me. So that's, and as I went, so I've been back in every decade. I've been significant amount of time in every decade since 1960. You could feel it shifting. On the one hand, on the other hand, and I've talked to I was talking about these Swiss kids. They grew up. Actually, Dad grew up in Chicago. And new friends of mine. He went to. He was 2 years older than I. Their dad became a therapist in Switzerland. Was completely fluent in Swiss German, but they're Swiss. They play football. He's in the Swiss Army. They carry themselves as Swiss. They speak Swiss, and as soon as you see them, you know they're Swiss. And anybody who they don't get Uberproofed, carded. They don't get carded because it's just obvious. I was with one of them last May, and we were talking. I said, "Well, does this ever happen to you?" He says, "No," but his buddy, who had dreads, pink, and piercings, he got proofed all the time. He got carded all the time, and he was white. So it's not quite. I don't know how to. There are a lot of Swiss. I adopted black children, but that was more than a generation ago. So there are a lot of very, very Swiss people of color who carry themselves like Swiss and feel Swiss. So your stuff is interesting for me. I would be curious to do that with some Swiss, and because in Austria, I would expect is less open. I mean, if you look, they just voted to write his government in. So I would, depending on where you go, I imagine Austria looks different than Germany. East Germany looks different than West Germany, and Switzerland looks different than all of them. That's my intuition.
I enjoyed both of your presentations, and I was thinking about being black in mostly white spaces, and I thought of two quintessential Americans, one Malcolm X and Barack Obama, who both in periods of their life were in mostly white spaces where they stood out, and Malcolm X was voted the class speaker, and Barack Obama was Barack Obama. So, but my point is, maybe being out of space or being black in a white space is part of the global, maybe not the global, but the black experience in the diaspora. So it is not really so such a contra or against what being black means.
Speak to that. So some thoughts on that. I actually recently attended the White Privilege Conference at Ryerson last weekend, and it was an interesting talk about that because within that, existing in that white space, there's also a sort of an overarching, again, the comment someone made about black girls talking too loud, I've heard that. Somebody didn't want to move their office near mine because I was way too loud, and I am just enthusiastic. You know, so I do think, though, that you sometimes, and I mean, I may be speaking only for me, I have to temper some things in that white environment that I'm in. And I think it's so unconscious now because growing up in a white family, I wasn't even aware of it, but down to things like these shoes are not acceptable at the work I used to work at. But now I work for myself, and I'm doing some more projects that are giving me more meaning, and I feel like I'm not going to suddenly throw on a Nigerian outfit because I don't know if that's where my African roots are from, but I feel loosened from that living in that white environment. And maybe, I don't know, maybe I wasn't really aware of it until recently and it's coming open. So to your point, I think that is what the normal is, but I think that the normal needs to change because I think that in that white environment, a lot of the things that culturally, you know, a colonialistic viewpoint, those are being overlaid onto how I can interact in that environment. And I don't know that that's me.
And I grew up largely white environment. And, but what went with that, coming from black families, I had to be cautious all the time. I wouldn't go out the door without mother reminding me around my behavior standards and my language. And I carried myself. I mean, it was impossible to get out the door without getting a lecture from my mother because she knew I was dealing with white folks all the time. And my kids can tell when I get on the phone immediately if it's someone white or someone black I'm talking to because there's a little switch in the cadence and they know it immediately.
But interestingly, so you being a black male and in a family that is black, I mean, I never had any of those talks. My parents couldn't relate to it at all. You know, and I think that they're being very brave as they watch me going on this journey at, you know, they've had 50 years of quiet and now I'm starting to dig into it. And I think that this is a completely new area. They never thought that I might not naturally have tendencies that are in their environment, but because I'm in there, those are the ones that are nurtured. I mean, why did, you know, my mom got her master's when she was in her 40s, so I got a master's. Like, maybe I never would have done that in a different environment. But I do think, you know, you had those talks because your family could bring that. My parents had no clue about being black. You know, my mom was persecuted for carrying around a baby who was not white and having to learn that. But really, those talks about how do you cope in the world where you're the only, I don't think that we ever had that
So
chat.
you didn't have the black code, the male black code thing about how you have to be careful.
So did that free me to walk around the world just like they did? Maybe.
Yeah, no.
So I'd like to ask you too to think about some of the points that Daniel made in his paper. So these papers particularly talked about defining yourself as black vis-a-vis a white environment, but I'm wondering to what degree your notions of blackness also have to do with either African American culture or with global blackness, and if that's changed over the course of your life. I'm thinking, for instance, what Daniel said about now the global Black Lives Matter movement and how people are identifying black as black in maybe a different way globally.
So I don't really think that I think of myself as black. And when I look around my home and then I go to a neighbor who is a Jamaican neighbor and I look around their home, they have a Jamaican black culture infiltrating and being part of their environment. And I look at my home and I don't have anything that I think is identified with any particular black culture. When I think about the environment, so those of you that may or may not know, there's a talk show host. Her name is Marcy Ian. She used to be on the morning news, and she is black. And she was pulled over by Toronto police in her own driveway the last time, but pulled over 3 times in the last 8 months. And to me, when I hear about that, I get concerned about, will I get pulled over in Barrie? Will my husband get pulled over? And I think that in that global conversation that you were trying to loop in, I think that that is more awareness of the Black Lives Matter, and there's a group of people that don't like to hear that, and maybe this is how they're responding, and I'm worried about it. I didn't worry as much about that until the last little while, and since the election in the US, I feel more fearful. So is that me identifying as a black person? I think it is, because if I was just identifying as a white person, I might be upset by it, but not feel fearful.
I have 3 different thoughts. Problem for me was being born on the University of Chicago campus, having my dad get his PhD when I was 3, growing up in a white church, going to Europe when I was 13. I had a black experience, but I didn't have a typical black experience. And so the expectations for me around black folks was that I was supposed to have certain attitudes and that I didn't have. And so that was always a tension for me, and I got caught. I couldn't say I had a Swiss boarding school education. That dropped out of my conversation because I knew as soon as I said it, I'd be labeled as bougie. So I got quite careful both around black folks and white folks, depending on the information. The situation. So that, and I'd hide different things from different groups. What I wanted to be was me, was find situations where I could be me, which is transracial. So as a minister, I know the basic questions are spiritual questions that has to do with my essential humanness and my essential sense of being, and how do I get, that's what I think Carter was after, actually. That's what I've come to. He got heavily into arts and very heavily into yoga. Because he was trying to strip off all these identities so he could be his essential self. So I think one actually has to go after one's essential self. And once one finds that essential self with its mosaic of identities, and encompasses and integrates all of those, then you get to be yourself, and I don't have to hide this piece of me or that piece. Except I still have to be cautious, because I was stopped on Roncesvalles. I had dreads down here back then. It was about 10 years ago. I was very clear at that moment. I was responsible for de-escalating it. That I couldn't count on the officer. How to be respectful but direct. And he knew very quickly when he spoke to me that this was a mistake. I think somebody's neighbor had called. I was waiting for some white friends to show up, and they didn't show up. In the middle of this conversation, they showed up. They're all white women. They were pissed. And they chewed him out. And I realized, I told them, we got in afterwards, I couldn't have done that. If I had done what you had done, I'd be in jail now. It was a big lesson for all of us. So there's pieces I can never let go of, and that's one of them. I have to, in those situations, my job is to get through alive.
That actually brings up this question that I have. I've been reading the Christopher Emdin for White Folks Who Teach in the Hood, and he also talks about sort of blacks who have sort of don't have this mentality of the hood as no longer being black or as thinking like white people. And I guess my question is, to what extent is blackness something that's essential? To what extent, and I think there's no answer to this question, you know, to what extent is it something that is constructed by white dominant sort of culture? To what extent is it part of a mosaic? And I guess then sort of thinking about, you know, it's interesting then that you say that your relatives in Switzerland are Swiss. Does that mean they're no longer black? And I guess this comes back to Daniel's work too, about sort of when one becomes white or black, and to what extent is that a choice, and to what extent is that imposed from the outside? And this is, in gender studies, there's this comfort with talking about, you know, sort of fluidity, and it doesn't seem that that's possible, perhaps because it's not politically possible to talk about it when we're talking about race.
So I've known the kids since they were actually in their mother's womb, but they're not my cousins. But they feel Swiss. But they travel. I mean, they're Swiss and they're not Swiss, if that makes any sense, because they're in the system, they accept the system, and yet there's a way in which they have one foot outside the system. A colleague, a senior colleague, wanted to write. He was mixed race, grew up in New Hampshire. His dad was a black lawyer, his mother was a secretary. And he talked about protective coloring, that he fit completely into New England society, but his coloring, there's certain assumptions he couldn't make, and he was thankful that he couldn't make them. For him, it was a blessing to be able to stand outside and critique the society. So, oh, and another thing, I'm quite, bring back to Daniel, I'm really quite curious about, is there a global black consciousness, or will that divide around between people of the diaspora, and that they have a particular consciousness that people say who remained in the African continent, who actually probably identify local, regionally, as opposed to as Pan-African, though I'm not sure. I'm curious what you find out.
Well, I just have a comment on that, which was one of the things I found out when I was interviewing the 7 black women. Was I had written a draft of one of my interviews, and the woman, I had mentioned her husband as a black man, and she told me, no, he's not black, he's Guyanese. So I don't know if we can have a global blackness if we are all not one. You still have to recognize individual differences, and it is transnational from all these different places. I don't know if you are always going to relate to someone just because you don't fall into the pot of black. It's not homogeneous.
I'm conscious of time. It's 12:45, so we may have one or two more questions, I think.
Just briefly, I wanted to ask, because it's been alluded to but not labeled, and that is the whole idea of one other thing that causes intersectionality across race, and that's class, and how that plays into how you function in the world that you may or may not deem your own. And in being a transnational person, or being of the diaspora period, and I believe that we all are people of color, are connected to the diaspora in and of itself globally. Could you speak to that and the role it plays in where you find yourselves, perhaps previously, but also at this stage?
Go ahead.
I'll start. I'll try and keep it short because I know we're on a timeline. So that is an interesting question because I think that when I wrote one of my notes in introducing my parents, and I was going to say that they were students, and I didn't know what to call them. I was going to call them middle-class white students because they were in college at McMaster when I was little. And I think that, it's interesting, though, given that there's a lot of education in my house and that is one of our things that we go for, I actually don't think we've had any really serious conversations about how that's impacted my blackness, because I don't really know what that looks like. I don't have any model in my life. I had no role models that were black men or women to look to from any other social class or at all. So I can't speak to that from my own experience, but I think it does have a part. It has to.
So how many people here done the power shuffle? Have you done the power shuffle? You know what that is? Power shuffle is, they say, you're white and you step forward, you're black, you're male, you step forward, woman, you step back, you're queer, you step back, you're heterosexual. So you do this one after the other, and as you go through, some people are going to end up over there, and some people are going to end up back there. You know where I end up on the power shuffle? No, I don't end up back there. I end up there. So I'm quite clear on my class location, and I try and get my daughter. I say, "Hun, you're fourth generation college educated woman. That's, for an African American woman, that is almost unheard of." And
that relates to privilege, though, right? Where we all can look at ourselves and look at the privilege we have. So class and the benefits I receive from that, I do view that as being a privilege over somebody who would look like me and not be in that situation. And they may have other privileges that I do not. There's hearing privilege, there's able-bodied privilege. We're all speaking to some of those things in this room. But yeah, it is a privilege.
And the obligation is just to be aware of it.
I'm not sure if I have a question or a comment. I'll begin as a comment, but I'd like to add something to this discussion. I study child, and one of the narratives that circulates in that realm is that the black kids don't do well because they're acting white. I forgot the guy's name, but it's like the biggest theorist that everyone goes to. Yeah, there you go. That black students don't do well because to do well, they become ostracized as being white. Well, I really don't agree with him. And I don't even agree with kind of a lot of what we're talking about today, and I'll tell you why. I grew up in the military, so I had a similar experience. And yes, I felt different and still feel different if I'm around certain areas, and maybe it is class related. But I think we do ourselves an injustice, too, in this conversation when we sort of say we're not like the other black people, because I think there's more of us that have had those privileges. They may not look like us, and they may be fourth generation or third generation or military or whatever. I think that yesterday was an example in terms of representation. I think if all you ever see is a certain image of a certain type of African American, and then when you see a different image, the name will not be named, or even in Blackish, where they're now moving up into this, I can't associate with that narrative either. So I think that representation may have something to do with it, so that we change our own language around what it means to be black and who's black and how different I am, because I'm not the same kind of black as somebody else is black. I think if we really look close, we discover all of us are all different blacks, whatever that is. And what binds us is exactly what you said, how, and I have just become aware of that part myself, the fear that I have to go into Louis Vuitton the other day. Should I? Should I not? I opted not to. Or the second thought I had when I accidentally went into Starbucks and then realized I shouldn't be in there. But my son worked in Starbucks his whole way through school in a very upscale neighborhood. So I'm just saying that, not that I disagree, but I'm just saying what responsibility do we have and how can we move forward in changing that narrative of what it means to be black and how we opt out because of our different experiences when perhaps as we're discovering more people have those experiences than we think. Does that make a little bit of sense?
Yeah, and some of that I'm trying to do in my blog because I met 7, black women that live, 15 minutes from me that I didn't know. I've lived there for 12 years. So trying to have those conversations and trying to put it out there. Yes, I mean, if you aren't a black woman, I probably won't interview you, but that doesn't stop you from reading it and learning that these are normal people. This is what they bring and this is their story.
I thank you so much. This has been a remarkable conversation. Maybe lunch waiting for us, I believe, and maybe it's we need it after this. But I think we should thank Michèle and Mark for this terrific conversation that they've had today.